Good evening, everybody. Steve Freeman's going to talk about a democratic social republic, what this means, going to explain what it actually means in concrete terms. Over to you, Steve.
Okay, comrades, I'm just going to do a quick screen share as I do. I'm going to do that. I'm going to whack that up there, and then I'm going to do that. And then I'm going to move it on. Boris Johnson won't be on the front of our screen very much longer, but he still is. He's still there, still shaking hands with the Queen. So he's still there. Okay, comrades, I'm going to just talk about this idea of a democratic and social republic. We've talked about it before. It's been in our previous things before, but I think that the three talks I want to give is part setting us up, hopefully, to become a group. And this is one of the issues that has arisen, what we mean by this term. So I thought I would go over these arguments again, ones we met before, but not repeating the previous talk, just giving it some new angles on it. So I'm going to have an introduction. I'm going to put quite a bit of emphasis on the idea of a minimum program, the minimum Republican program. Then I'm going to look at the sort of argument about democratic versus socialist republics. You'll see why that is. Then briefly what we talked about before is what are bureaucratic states. And then I thought I would come up with a new idea really, which is the World Socialist Republic idea. And then finally back to the Democratic Republic and ending up back with Tony Benn in the Commonwealth of England. Okay, so those are the points that I want to cover, and I'm going to try and keep an eye on the time, Carol, as well, so that it doesn't go on too long. I can talk on for hours, and you know what I mean, I'll tend to lose track of time, but I'd rather have as more discussion. So I'm going to try and stick it to 20 minutes if I can, and then comrades can come in through questions and take it that way. So let me just do my introduction, my little introductory point first of all then, which was going to be this. Put that up there. I thought I'd say, interestingly, I think this argument can be found in the history of the Russian Revolution somewhere. Dig in there. In 1922, they were debating, it was after the Civil War ended in 1920, 1921. And during 1922, there was a debate going on as to what they should call the new state. And it turns out, and I didn't know about it, honestly, it's quite an obscure thing really, but it's kind of interesting when I saw it, that Lenin wanted to call the new state the Union of Soviet Republics of Europe and Asia. That was his preferred argument. It doesn't contain the word socialist. And maybe that's accidental, I don't know, because certainly the word socialist got bandied around quite a lot. But I think it's not accidental. But the one that won the day was the Union, we know the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, that's the one. And of course, Lenin was backing the first one, and it turned out Stalin was the backer of the second one. So in a way, Stalin was winning at this point. And I think it goes back, in my mind, it goes to an argument about whether you could build socialism in one country. Another debate that was going to become very famous. And Stalin's argument, I suppose, that he wanted to call it the Soviet Socialist Republics was because he intended to build socialism in one country. The traditional Bolshevik view was you could never have socialism in Russia for two reasons. Because it was a relatively isolated country, and it didn't have the material circumstances, and it was largely a peasant economy. It wasn't a proletarian country where most people were wage workers. It was largely, the vast majority of the population were peasants. And so the argument that the Bolsheviks had for a certain period of time was we couldn't build socialism in Russia. Only if Germany joined in, and it looks as if in 1918 Germany might become a socialist, you know, might take the same direction as Russia. Then Germany and Russia together might be able to do something, but Russia alone wouldn't be able to. So I think in those two formulations, and you'll notice that the first formulation is a little bit more, I think it would fit with the argument I'd want to make about that Russia never was a socialist republic, but it was a democratic at one point. It was a democratic republic at one point, and it was a social republic at one point. But Lenin had to retreat on that. So I haven't really done enough to investigate this point, but I think it's in a way, a prefigurative, I only discovered this, prefiguring the debate we're having somewhere, which is where where we are today. Remember the resolution that we had, which was passed by ourselves. We passed a resolution with reference to Tony Benn and his Commonwealth Bill, 1991, 1992 bill. And that resolution that we debated as Republican Labour, we took it to the Socialist Labour Network and they passed it. They passed the same resolution. But they made this tiny addition. They added the word, these three letters, IST to it, and turned it into a democratic socialist republic. And they've never really explained what they meant by a socialist republic, by the way. And they've never tried to explain. They passed a resolution, they've never tried to explain what it means. So I always thought that, in my mind, it was just a kind of wrecking amendment. In other words, we're never really going to carry out that. They made that amendment. It kind of torpedoes what we were trying to get at. But they didn't really intend to do anything about it anyway afterwards. And most of the Republican Labour comrades, including myself, voted against the amended resolution because we thought it was a record. It got away from understanding. And so we went back to them and said, could we have a proper debate about this? Because it was only like, 3 minutes for, 3 minutes against. There's important theoretical questions there that need a proper discussion. So we went back to them, as you will call, comrades, to ask them, can we have a proper debate about this? To see what the arguments were. And as you know, so far, they are not interested, which of course is why we cannot be interested in a way in having a merger with them for that reason. I thought I would start, and now I've just one other little point. It may seem a bit crazy that we're falling out over three letters. I mean, how could we, what could, you've heard about this, people fall out over dancing on the head of a pin, you know what I mean? So I can imagine everybody going, look at this bunch of crazies, you know what I mean? Three letters, they're falling out. But it's worth remembering, and I always remember this, that the split between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks in 1903 or 1904 or whenever it was, they split over a rule in the party. Now, when you read that rule, it's rule number 1. So when you read that rule, the two versions of it, you can hardly see the difference between, what they're arguing about here. It seems ridiculous. But it turned out there were some principles in there. And when you really investigated it, they were diverging quite sharply into one group of Mensheviks and another group of Bolsheviks. So even small, if you like, shades of difference, if you really examine them, can end up being quite important and significant in what's happening. Now, I thought I would turn next to the question of, let me have a look a minute, of program. And I thought I would start with the idea of the minimum program, because I hope this will illustrate a little bit where we are. So if I move to my next one, I've got 3 ideas of program. I would argue that the democratic and social republic is it's a universal program in a way which stands for the democratic and social reform of capitalism by the working class. And it can be applied to different conditions in different countries. It could be applied in the UK, it could be applied in Russia, Ukraine, France, United States. And it could be achieved by winning the support of the majority of the working class. And historically, this idea was the idea that was called the minimum program. And the minimum program was defined as a series of immediate reforms which can achieve Republican democracy. Practical reforms, sometimes which might have revolutionary implications. Wikipedia, I looked at Wikipedia on this, and Wikipedia defines the minimum as reforms which, quote, taken as a whole, realize the key democratic republican measures enacted by the Paris Commune. Again, I'm going to take that as the gospel definition, but it would certainly work for me. So the idea of the minimum program, if you like, is it is a program of reform. It's a program of democratic and social reform, practical program. Now the question might arise, well, if you want to abolish capitalism, why would you seek to reform it? It's like saying, if you want to abolish capitalism, why would you join a trade union trying to secure improvements? And the answer to that, of course, is that the struggle for reforms, both by political and trade union means, is the way in which the working class becomes a political class and trains itself in political struggle. It prepares itself to the day when it can become the powerful force in society. So one of the first examples of a minimum program was in 1880 by the French, in the French Workers' Party, in a program that was drawn up by, I can't pronounce his name properly, Guesade, Paul Lafarge, you've probably heard of him, Engels and Marx. And Marx drafted the introductory section of this program, and it was considered to be a maximum program because it identifies the aim of abolishing capitalism, of taking over capitalism fully. But then it says in the next section, after this first section, it says, as a means of organization and struggle, we enter elections with a minimum program. And then it goes on to define this minimum program. So the idea was that you set the aim of communism or world socialism, and then you'd have a minimum program that was so connected to the working class that you could go to working class people in an election with your minimum program of practical reforms and win their support. So that's what the minimum program was. It's not the full program, it's part of it. It can be a democratic, it has to have a democratic republic in it, and it can be a social republic because it's connected to the idea of the Paris Commune. And so where was, yeah, there was a dispute that came, there was a dispute between Marx and Lafarge after this, and Gestayer, pronounce his name, over the minimum program. Marx thought that the minimum Republican program was achievable and would improve the position of the working class, whereas the other two, Gestayer and Lafarge, were cynical about it. They thought these things were unachievable because the capitalists would resist them, capitalists wouldn't give them. So it was about, in a way, tricking the workers into making demands, rather a sort of bait, as it were, to lead them away from the Radical Party, which was the main kind of reforming party in France at the time. And then they would realize that capitalism was unreformable and had to be abolished. So they saw the minimum program as a kind of trick to get the workers fired up to realize they'd have to overthrow capitalism. Whereas Marx wasn't cynical about that at all. He saw it straightforward. There are these reforms, they can be achieved, and we should fight for them. And that will advance the interests of the working class. Now, in a way, you could contrast that. I've called it a liberal program. There's another kind of reform program that we are going up against, and that is you could call it the liberal program, the program of social monarchy, or the program of a constitutional monarchy. A program that says, we need reforms. The working class needs reforms in the UK, and we can elect a Labour government to bring about these reforms. So that's also a reform program, and yet it's within the parameters of the Constitution, and that's essentially what the Labour manifesto of 2007, 2017 and 2019 was all about. So in theoretical terms, the liberal program and the minimum program are both about reforming the system, But the minimum program is about breaking the system in a certain sense by going in the direction of real democracy. And that's the difference. That's the difference. So in a way, Corbyn's Liberal social program of 2019 is different to Ben's Commonwealth, because Ben's Commonwealth is a kind of example of a minimum program. He wouldn't have called it a minimum program. Ben doesn't have a maximum program. You know, he doesn't call for world communism or the abolition of capitalism on a global scale. But the demands that he's got are equivalent to a program of reforms, practical reforms, achievable reforms that can be found. Now, this contrast, by the way, between the liberal program and the minimum program can be found historically in the 1880s. In the mass party of the German working class in the 1880s and 1890s was the German Social Democratic Party. Now, that party had a program of reform. It was a mass party, okay? But its program was social monarchist. That is to say, it didn't seek to abolish the Kaiser system. It didn't promote the idea of a democratic republic. It sought to win power within the Kaiser system to bring reforms. And that's contrasted with the RSDLP, the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party of the same time, which had a minimum republican program. And the number one demand was the abolition of Tsarism and its replacement by a democratic republic. So I'm about to say that what was done in that meeting was that our formulation is about a minimum program, practical reforms for the here and now that could be an election manifesto straight away. And we were being kind of torpedoed by people who were trying to bring in some kind of maximalist idea in through the back door and in a way torpedo it. So. I wanted then to go back now to the Democratic Republic, which is this one here. So what are the arguments? I think the best way to think about it is to just strip out the word social. Just let's go back and say what the basic argument here is between a democratic republic and a socialist republic. So what is the socialist case for a democratic republic? And I think there are three basic arguments to support the socialist case for a democratic republic. The first one is that a democratic republic is valuable in its own right, is in and of itself a gain for the working class, particularly if the working class take part in defining how this extra democracy, how this new democracy, how much, what it's like and how much extra democracy we're going to gain. So I think a democratic republic would be valuable even if we didn't go even beyond that. It would be real gains because the influence of the working class would be stronger in a democratic republic simply by the fact the more democratic it was, the higher proportion of the population is working class, the influence of the working class would be higher. So that's argument number one. It's worthwhile on its own merits, as it were. The second argument is that the democratic republic is a transitional demand. In other words, a democratic republic leads us towards a social and even a socialist republic. It's the only way to go to get there. And if you don't go along this route, then you're either going to argue for maximum program, which is kind of ultra left, or you're going to end up with a Corbyn program, which isn't taking us anywhere but into a dead end. So the idea that it's an argument we've used, I think it's a second argument that it's a transitional demand. And then I've got a third argument here, which can simply be this, to say this, that, and I've called it a reform revolution. What's peculiar about the Republic? I mean, you could say PR was votes for women is a democratic reform, proportional representation is a democratic reform, electing people to the House of Lords would be a democratic. There are many, many democratic reforms. what is peculiar about the republic, the democratic republic, is it's a reform like proportional representation, but it's peculiar because it has revolutionary implications, because it says that the state is not going to work in the way it did before. It's a challenge to the way in which state power and political power actually works. And hence, as you go in this direction, then the class struggle kind of increases, because it becomes clear there are some big issues at stake here. Tony Benn has a quote from Machiavelli, which Niccolo Machiavelli in 1513, and I like the quote, so I thought I would use it at this point. He says, "It should be borne in mind there is nothing more difficult to handle, more difficult of success, and more dangerous to carry through than initiating changes in a state's constitution." It's a really dangerous and difficult thing to do. Why is that? He says, the innovator, the people who are trying to make the change, make enemies of all who prosper under the old order. So everybody who's doing well under the old system is absolutely against it. And then he says, and only lukewarm support is coming from those who would prosper under the new system. So the people who see their interests tied up with the old order are desperately fighting to stop that constitutional change. And the people who might benefit from it, the other people, the outsiders, as it were, they're not totally convinced yet that it's going to work. So they're a little bit indifferent to it. So in a way, that's the basis of the counter-revolution. Some people are desperate to restore the old order. Let me just look a second. I might go back on the main. Let me have a look a second. Okay. I think I might come out of this point here. Stop sharing. Okay, come back to that a second. I'll try to speed up a little bit. The theoretical part, I think, is to try to go over what I've talked about before, which is to talk about different kinds of states. And the first kind of state that I wanted to talk about was the bureaucratic state. I'm going to argue that the bureaucratic state is the general form of class rule in capitalist society. And this is because the executive power of the state sits at the top or on top of a giant bureaucratic machine, and power flows from the top, from the oligarchy, down through a class-based hierarchy protected by secrecy, etc. So the characteristic of all capitalist states is that minority, the capitalist class, can rule the majority by having a huge bureaucratic regime to do so. And so we can identify then different kinds of bureaucratic states. We mentioned monarchical states, whether they be absolute or autocratic ones, the Tsarist regime, our own constitutional monarchy, the liberal monarchies of Spain, Holland, and others, okay, all rest on bureaucratic control. Then you have presidential states, which may be called republics. They could be liberal republics like America, France, and Germany, autocratic republics like Turkey, Myanmar, Egypt, even fascist republics like Nazi Germany. But these are all bureaucratic states. Rule is always through a bureaucracy. It's a rule by a small elite at the top, an oligarchy through the bureaucracy. And I would add to that bureaucratic so-called socialist states, the Soviet Union, East Germany, North Korea, etc. This is again a bureaucratic form of rule, even though it's calling itself socialist. So, although those many states that call themselves republics and even call themselves democratic republics, when you look into them, are really bureaucratic systems of government. So we're contrasting the idea of a democratic republic as something which is fully democratic, i.e. one which liquidates, if we gets rid of bureaucratic power, makes everything accountable to people from below. So I was going to come on to my next, just looking at my notes here, and then I'll come to an end, draw it to an end. I was thinking about, well, what does the Socialist Labour Network actually think a socialist republic actually is? Because I'm not entirely sure what they mean by that. So I realized that it could be a reference to the former Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So maybe the Socialist Labour Network is arguing that we should adopt the Soviet model of the Soviet Union in Britain. Okay, maybe that's what they're arguing. It's a possible thing. I mean, we need to guess what they're arguing. We need a bit of guesswork and a bit of detective work because they haven't actually told us yet. And then I thought of another way of thinking about it. Thinking about a socialist republic, could it be seen as a world republic necessary to bring imperialism and capitalism to an end? In other words, it might be something that belongs in the idea of the maximum program, an expression of the dictum in the Communist Manifesto, which says, workers of the world unite. A world socialist republic, I think, is not a utopian idea. The United Nations is a body almost like a world parliament. But of course, it's limited because it's limited by the system of imperialism. It reflects the imperialist and capitalist nature of the world in which we live. The UN Security Council reflects the imperialistic character of the world economy. It's not a democratic body. Many of the delegates elected there are people from different countries, nations and states, dictatorships, liberal democracies, they're all mixed up in there. But a world socialist republic would be something like having a body like the United Nations made up of democratic representatives of democratic countries. And then it could deal with the issues, global problems like world poverty, like global warming, like nuclear weapons, like imperialist war, like world money, and a whole number of questions that can't actually be dealt with in one country. We have a problem that capitalism is such a global system that we cannot solve many of its problems in one country. And we need global bodies to do that. So maybe we should be conceiving of a socialist republic, if we have that, as something which is global. And that our task in one country, in England or wherever we happen to be, is to win a thoroughly democratic and social republic. I'll end at this point, comrades, because we've heard all this before. I will end by just end with the Commonwealth of England. The English version, I think, of a democratic and social republic is the Commonwealth, because it's a reference back to the English Republic of 1649. A future Commonwealth of England is not just a democratic republic, although it would be that. It has to be a social republic, meaning a democratic republic specifically dedicated to supporting the health, welfare, and security of all its citizens. And that means the universal provision of public services such as health, education, housing, etc. A social republic does not define in advance how much of the economy was publicly owned and how much would be privately owned. It doesn't abolish capitalism. It certainly changes it significantly. And it's in that framework that Tony Benn's Commonwealth Bill has to be understood. And although Benn's not a Marxist, nevertheless, his understanding of where we need to get to, I think, is absolutely fine. He says, in Common Sense, in the book on this, he says, I'll finish on this point, the time has come to refound, he says, our public institutions upon principles of the common weal, democracy and internationalism, more in tune with the needs of the 21st century. And he sums up his proposals to say it's the most important change in law and practice would be that everybody would become a citizen of a democratic and secular commonwealth dedicated to the welfare of all, with fundamental human rights enshrined in a charter dealing with political, legal, social, economic dimensions. So for Benny, it's not just purely a democratic republic. It is a democratic republic, but it extends itself much beyond there. It's not the abolition of capitalism, but it's a step, practical, possible, democratic step on that way. We could say a lot more about the lessons of the Russian Revolution, but I'm not going to do that right now. That'll be a good place for me to stop. Thank you, comrades.
I'm terribly sorry. Thank you very much, Steve. That was absolutely fascinating, as usual. And I think completely revolutionary. We're talking here about taking out, completely changing the system. We're talking about getting rid of the monarchy, getting rid of the crown, having citizens, I can't even say that word, citizens who are running things from the bottom via, local assemblies, etc., etc. Trade union rights actually entrenched in a constitution. It is completely revolutionary, actually. And yet it is, we can call it a republic, and I think it can appeal to so many people under that name. Whereas you start talking about revolution and people do shy away, I think. The majority of people get very worried about that word. But this is revolutionary, absolutely revolutionary. But I hope it is achievable.